Hello, everybody, and welcome to our presentation on the intersectionality of historical women's activism. As you can probably tell, my name is Mia, and with my group mates Alexis and Corey, we have created this website for you, which will house all of our presentation, as well as some extra little bits, which I'll explain right now. So, if you've made it to this audio guided tour, then you probably read a little bit about how this is going to work. But essentially, myself as well as my group mates are going to guide you through this whole website and just give you kind of an overview of what we're arguing and our main points and the figures that we'd like to highlight. And yeah. Additionally, there are going to be on a few of the pages some interactive stories for you guys to check out. So those will be in text form and they'll kind of be like a choose your own adventure type of thing. So hopefully that's going to be a fun little extra for you guys and it'll really, help you connect to these kinds of messages that we're trying to promote. So yeah, so scrolling to the overview section of the homepage, push for suffrage and the push for women's rights have historically, as we've seen in the wonderful historiography presentation that we just watched, have historically been not only centered around white women, but oftentimes not even centered around women at all. So there's been a lot of cracks and holes where, really important people and movements have fallen through. So we really hope that with our presentation, we can help kind of shed light on all of the really important people, um, especially people of color, that helped in these movements and that have been oftentimes excluded. Yeah, so with women's activism especially, what we've found throughout this project is that a big running theme and a big motivator for a lot of these women was this idea of sisterhood and this idea of community. Um, and I think that ties in, really well to the idea of intersectionality because a lot of these fights, these struggles for independence and for freedom, they're not single faceted. There's a lot of different sides to these things, and the more that people find that what they have in common, the more that they band together and the more powerful their words and their approaches can be. So that's what we found in our research. And as to why this format, well, if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see that paragraph on there. But we really hope that in having this website, a thing that's gonna be up forever and last forever until, the internet explodes somehow. um, we really hope that we're going to give these figures and give these events serve them proper homage and serve them the respect that they deserve, as well as with our interactive stories. We hope that with the people experiencing them and reading them, that it'll inspire a sense of empathy and a sense of connection, and even to an extent a little bit of that sisterhood that was really, really powerful today and historically. Um, and we really want to connect all of you to that feeling and to that camaraderie. So, those are our goals with this project, and I really hope you enjoy it. So, right now, I'm going to pass it off to Corey, who's going to take you to the next page of the website.
Now let's take a look at the landscape of women's suffrage and the intersection of women's activism. In this section, we will broadly define a few time periods along with the basic timeline that were critical in the development of women's activism, and detail a little bit about the culture and women's place in society at the time, staying focused on the intersectionality of the movement. I will be examining some of the important dates of women's activism through the images, but feel free to take a deeper look into the whole timeline that we've created below. The first image is the 1848 Women's Rights Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York, where important suffragists such as Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton created the agenda for women's suffrage for decades to come. Next, we have an illustration of the 15th Amendment that was ratified in 1870 that gave the right to vote to all U.S. citizens regardless of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. This act excluded women and was endorsed by many black suffragists, but in doing so, white women felt betrayed, creating an expanding divide within the suffrage movement. Next is a picture of the American Equal Rights Association, which would disband in 1870 because of the 15th Amendment into two rival suffrage associations. A more progressive organization, the National Women's Suffrage Association, headed by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and a more conservative one, the American Women's Suffrage Association, headed by Lucy Stone. Here it is important to understand that not all women fought for the civil rights of black people or the abolition of slavery, and we should not whitewash the movement to make all these women seem perfect. We must learn about the intersectionality of the movement and hear especially from women of color, that we will be talking about later. Next, we have the Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913 that was organized by Alice Paul, campaigning for the 19th Amendment, where white women led black women forced to march in the back of the parade. Again, we see racism that was present in the suffrage movement that is important to keep in mind. The 19th Amendment would later be ratified in 1920, giving white women the right to vote. Although this was a huge accomplishment, this did not protect the voting rights for women of color, who continued to face disenfranchisement and had to continue fighting for their rights, which we will talk more about later. The civil rights movement and the efforts of black women at the intersection of race and gender would finally lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, which helped overcome barriers that disenfranchised black women from voting. This act would be renewed in 1975 to protect other minority groups. And finally, today, women still do not have equal rights, and we must all work together in order to finally achieve equality. Now, if you would like, continue to a more detailed timeline towards the bottom of the page, and then continue throughout the website to learn more specifically about the women and organizations who fought for these changes.
As you read through the suffrage tab of our website, explore the near century-long efforts of women to win the vote. Read through our overview of the national suffrage movement that was believed to have ended with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, but also make sure to check out our post-19th Amendment page, which contests this idea that the battle for gender and racial equality was really over. While learning about key women's rights activists like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, Lucretia Mott, Alice Paul, and Sarah and Angelina Grimke, also read about the organizations and societies they founded and participated in. Before the first National Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, women activists campaigned for abolition, for temperance, and for women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, in particular, fought for the rights of married and divorced women in relation to property, their wages, and guardianship of their children. These women, as well as Lucretia Mott, the Grimke sisters, and Lucy Stone, to name a few, were also involved in the anti-slavery movement. While you read about these suffragists' involvement in the anti-slavery movement, we would also like to acknowledge their racism and their refusal to ally with the movement for suffrage for freed African American men after the Civil War. White suffragists, like Stanton and Anthony, viewed the 15th Amendment as a distraction from the issue of women's rights, as it would grant the right to vote to only African American men. From this issue were born two rival suffrage associations, the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Stanton and Anthony, which turned its focus away from universal suffrage in favor of women's suffrage, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, founded by Lucy Stone, which continued to support suffrage for all. These organizations merged in 1890 to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which primarily focused on winning suffrage for white women. Another organization was founded by Alice Paul called the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. It later merged to become the National Woman's Party in 1917 and used militant tactics to persuade President Woodrow Wilson to support a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. Their efforts, as well as those of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, allowed for the ratification of the 19th Amendment on August 18, 1920. However, as these organizations we have mentioned drove out black suffragists, women like Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, you can read about in our abolition and civil rights sections, founded their own groups to campaign for voting protections for Black men and women. If you would like to learn more about the Seneca Falls Convention, the first ever women's rights convention that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized in Seneca Falls, New York in 1868, do not miss the interactive story in which we take you through the convention as if you had been there yourself. Thank you and enjoy. As you visit this section of our website, explore the efforts made by Asian American, Native American, and Mexican American women to define suffrage for all women. The ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1920 secured the right to vote to all United States citizens regardless of sex. However, voter suppression was widespread in the form of state-sanctioned literacy tests, poll taxes, as well as violence and racial discrimination towards women of color who came to vote at polling booths. Xenophobic legislation such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1892, which persisted until 1943, prevented Chinese men and women living in the United States from obtaining citizenship. The Immigration Act of 1924 also served to cut off immigration from other countries by placing quotas on the number of immigrants who could come to the United States from each country or continent, and it completely stopped Asian immigration. Additionally, legislation intended to prevent voting discrimination based on race did not include Native Americans in its protections. And, as the 15th Amendment allowed the states to decide who was able to vote, Native Americans were often disenfranchised. Even after the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which granted citizenship to registered members of federally recognized tribes, it took decades for all 50 states to extend the franchise to Native Americans. It was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, and the later amendment to the Voting Rights Act in 1975 that protected so-called language minorities, which included Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Hispanic Americans, from voting discrimination. While this act didn't address women specifically, it helped protect the groups to which they belonged from voter suppression. To learn more, read through the overview and take a look at the pictures. If you are interested in learning about some key figures in these post-19th Amendment suffrage movements, check out their short biographies. We have chosen to spotlight Chinese American suffragist Mabel Pinghua Lee, Hispanic and Native American activist Nina Otero Warren, and Native American lawyer and suffragist Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin. Towards the bottom of the section are some organizations with which these activists were associated. For example, Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin was involved in the Society of American Indians, which spoke to Congress and to the Office of Indian Affairs to lobby for Native American citizenship. Nina Otero Warren was involved in the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, a militant organization that fought for suffrage through rallies and demonstrations. Thank you, and enjoy this page of our website.
All right, hello everybody. So I am back, and together we're going to go through the abolition page of our website. So you'll see at the top, like the other pages, or I guess like the suffrage page, there's a button for the interactive story. So at any time, if you want to go check that out, just click there and it'll take you to the link. But yeah, so about abolition. Abolition is one of the, well, it's very interconnected with civil rights, so this argument can be made for both of them, but it's one of the issues that has the most crossing with suffrage, because a lot of the women who were pushing for abolition also pushed for suffrage, and of course vice versa. And interestingly, we actually do have a good amount of white women who advocated for abolition. And that was really important to the movement because, you know, there's, of course, with all the racism ingrained, you know, even just having abolition be an issue at all, there was an issue of people not really listening and people not really wanting to hear, because not only were some of these leaders women, they were also black women. So that's just like double layers of discrimination and double layers of hard-headedness and not wanting to hear the message. So we do want to give a little bit. We do want to give proper credit to the white women who were involved in the abolition movements, as their pushing for this did open a lot of people's eyes who would otherwise have not listened, to these black women. And of course, because abolition is an issue of slavery, it's an issue of and moved by black people. Black women are and have been at the center of this movement, and the forefront of this movement. So if you scroll down to our figures page, you'll see that lined up first we have, of course, Sojourner Truth, who gave her really influential speech called Anti-Woman at the 1851 Women's Convention. And it was about both women's rights and abolition. So again, like I said, there was a lot of crossing over with a lot of these figures. Um, and what she called out in her speech was a lot of, more cultural things that she witnessed. And she really commented on how she was seen as inferior, or how she was seen as, you know, not deserving of the same rights when she could do the same or even more than any man. So she says, I have as much muscle as any man, and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? Um, and she also says, I am as strong as any man that is now. And so, she draws a lot of these comparisons between the way she's treated and the way men are treated, or the way men see her. Um, and I think, just ingrained within that, while she did have other speeches, of course, specific to abolition and to civil rights, I think just ingrained in her argument is this idea of intersectionality, and this idea that, like, not only is she facing the discrimination of a woman, but she's also facing the discrimination of a black person, of a black woman. And that effect is, stacked, it's compounding. Um, Another interesting thing that we have noted here is that a man named Francis Gage actually had like this false transcription of her speech, which was totally, totally different than her original speech. Even the N word appears multiple times in his modified version, and a lot of the speech and the grammar is like I'm gonna say quote unquote dumbed down to like what I assume he thought a black woman should sound like. But we've linked that there, so if you guys want to check that out, that's pretty interesting. But moving on to Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells is a really, really prominent figure, both in abolition and in suffrage. So she did a lot of work for both of these causes. Um, and one of her, I think, most famous for abolition was her anti-lynching campaigns. So she went on, most prominently, her anti-lynching march and her anti-lynching speech. Um, and at these speeches, or at this speech, she talks about how, lynching is specific to black people, and that it's like so morally horrible and so like cruel, and yet it's justified by the by their race and by the fact that they are black. And somehow, even though it's one of the most cruel punishments that they have for any kind of thing at all, it's just passed by as normal, or as a status quo. And so she really, really gets at that in her speech there. And she's very important for both of these movements. Next, we have Angelina Grimke Weld. And Angelina also had, I believe, two sisters who were also pretty staunch activists for women's rights and for abolition. And she and her sister are actually noted as the only white Southern women who became abolitionists, or at least outwardly, family. And she had, firsthand experience about how slaves were treated, Um, and I think that gave her a really strong point of not only empathy but also experience to speak on this topic. And of course, her whiteness gave her a platform to really relay this message to other white people in a way that would push for the end that she and other activists wanted, which was abolition, but also in a way that was palatable to these people, which I think is really important. Um, Not that she was, the sole progenitor of this cause, but that whiteness was certainly a factor in having her voice be heard. So, um, and then of course next we have Harriet Tubman, who is a super famous figure in this movement. I think a lot of people know what she did, but she had the Underground Railroads, which she used to help slaves escape. Um, and after all of her service helping slaves escape, and being a huge figure for abolition, she also devoted her time to the suffrage movement, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, which we have mentioned before. Um, but yeah, I mean, her accomplishments are almost innumerable. We have them listed here for you to check out. But I think, more than anything, she was just such a beacon of hope and of power to this movement. People saw Harriet Tubman and they saw the person that helped all these slaves escape. They saw the person who fought and who came back and who helped others. And, they saw someone who provided hope. Next, we have Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Um, and she was actually a very well noted writer and specifically poet. But she was one of the first Black women to get published in the United States. And, that was a really big, I think, a big thing in its own, because not only was she being, validated and being recognized in a way that was concrete, um, and that was, actionable. It was also something that simply said, in like when something gets published, it's because, people think, hey, this is worth reading or this is worth listening to. Um, and just the significance of that thought alone, that, you know, a publisher publicly said, this black woman's voice is worth being read, and distributed it for the whole country to read, um, was a really important step. And people even today read her works and find that it's on par with or reminiscent of um, narratives and ideas that we would hear today about feminism and about women's rights and these kinds of things. But she also helped found the National Association of Colored Women in 1986. And so she had a really big role as a leader, not only as a writer, but also in her personal life, on a one-on-one, on more of a one-on-one basis, working with her community and working with groups in order to build this sisterhood that we've been mentioning throughout. If you scroll down, we have a few organizations that were prominent during the time period. So we have, like I mentioned, the National Association of Colored Women, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, the Women's National Loyal League, and the American Equal Rights Association. So, you know, we we have this page on each of our tabs on this website, and that's because we really believe that these organizations are one of the biggest markers of this idea of sisterhood and this idea of community. And you'll see in each tab there's loads of organizations, and that was just one of the big motivating factors, and that's what we like to highlight here. So If you want to check any of those organizations out, some of them have some pretty cool primary sources on them, so check those out. But yeah, that has been our abolition page. Now on to civil rights.
Now let's take a look at the intersection of women's activism and civil rights. As an overview, the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 allowed for the suffrage of white women, but while women of color who continued to face challenges, including poll taxes, literacy tests, denial of citizenship, outright violence, and intimidation. Because of this, the civil rights movement for black women was a fight for equality as a black person and as a woman, which was an important movement at the intersection of their identities. Many women played a crucial role in the civil rights movement, but many were not recognized for their importance because of the sexism within the movement. But their efforts were not in vain, and finally in 1965, the Voting Rights of 1965, signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, helped overcome barriers that disenfranchised black women from voting and was a key victory in the civil rights movement. You can read about more specifically what the Voting Rights Act did in the overview section. But in 1975, the Voting Rights Act was renewed to protect other minority groups, as we talked about in the post-19th Amendment tab. And although this is a major victory, women, especially women of color, still face inequality and continue to fight for their equal rights today. You can look at the images where we cite women marching during the Civil Rights Movement, as well as President Lyndon B. Johnson's signing of the Voting Rights Act. You can also also take a look at the important figures that were at this intersection of these two movements, including Mary Church Terrell, Nannie Helen Burroughs, and Dorothy Height, who all played a crucial role in the fight for civil rights as well as women's suffrage, and also take a look at the organizations. Some are similar to the organizations in abolition, but these organizations where women could come together were a key place where women were able to contest the racist and sexist systems around them. These places and movements allowed them to affinitize with each other and fight in solidarity against a cause, creating change in the world around them.